Okay, so we're going to do introducing a lecture here about race and ethnicity in the United States uh, or in the Americas, but mostly focused on the United States, mostly focused on the African American experience. It's just not, we don't have the time to expand out the complexities, the history, the length, but you can extrapolate that. And if you want more information, you can let me know. So we're going to share a screen and we're going to go to race and ethnicity, and we're going to in America, and we're going to play from the beginning. Okay, um, so race and ethnicity in America. Again, we're going to focus mostly on the African American experience, but we'll include some other groups, cultures, races, racialized groups as we go on. So let's get going. Okay, so the Americas prior to European colonialism, there are different estimates, theories as to when the Americas were populated. Most of Africa, sub-Africa, Asia was already populated, and the population was moving out to the rest of the globe, including coming through the Bering Straits. Now, the green was where land was before uh, the ice age ended and the oceans were rising. So the green was where land was, and then as the poles melted and the ice age subsided, obviously the waters the sea levels moved up, and so that limited the land. But there was migration into North America, and then down through Central America, and then down into South America. And there are, like I said, a lot of different theories as to when, but also who and when and how. There's some theories that say that African populations traveled across the ocean to South America before the migration from the north down to the south, but I'll let you research that. This is what the Americas, at least North America, looked like prior to European colonialism, prior to Columbus in 1492. You can see the many different cultural, different tribes or clans, or I guess we'll call them tribes, in the different parts. And of course, they were at different times at odds with each other as they entered into tensions and conflicts over trading, unfair trading, whose land, whose resources. Um, there were, and some tribes were a little more powerful and a little more oppressive than other tribes. Some tribes practiced enslaving other tribes when they conquered them. So, as you hopefully read in The Real History of Slavery by Soul, you understand that slavery has been a long institution of humanity. Okay. But there were, these cultures existed, and they were agriculture, and they had rules and norms and uh, different systems of economy and structures of they were most all of them were stratified into different power status and wealth within each tribe, between different tribes, um, kind of like in a sense, kind of like Europe, right? Instead of white clans and tribes and groups, you had native indigenous populations of different groups, tribes, clans, systems, and it was quite they had culture, they had religion, they had community, they had rules that provided stability and solidarity for their culture. They had different values and beliefs and norms, agriculture. um, so yeah, it was quite maybe more advanced than some of your perceptions. I don't know. And then the European colonialism started, right? Spain and Portugal from 1500 to 1600. We're going to focus on that 100 years, because the English didn't get into the picture until more than 100 years after Columbus. And these are on the left, the four voyages of Columbus, and that's kind of, maybe some of you think he discovered America, the United States. No, he didn't discover. There was no United States at the time, but most of his uh, where he landed were in the Caribbean, um, Jamaica, Cuba, some of the other. If you've been down to the Caribbean. Virgin Islands, things like that, and then parts of North America and Southern Central America. Okay, and there was no, at the beginning, there was no Atlantic slave trade. That had not happened. There was obviously slaves and slavery and slave trade. It just had not happened on the Atlantic slave trade from Africa over. There was an enslavement, a conquering and an enslavement of the indigenous populations, and I won't go into the details on that, but the Spanish were, and the Portuguese had the biggest navies. They were the most powerful of the European countries. England was busy fighting battles with the Scots and the Irish, mostly the Irish. In the 1500s, they had their own issues going on the British Isles, and so Portugal pretty much stayed in Africa, on Western Africa and Brazil, and the Spanish focused on. And here's some pictures of the Spanish Empire by the end of the 1500s, early 1600s. So you can see. The Spanish had what they called New Spain, which is today Mexico and parts of the United States, St. Augustine in Florida, um, and then all of Central America and where Colombia and Peru is today, Argentina, and again, Brazil were Portuguese, right? And there was a lot of conflict between the Portuguese and the Spanish. And that a lot of that dispute, there was a treaty that was settled by the Catholic Church and the Pope at the time. Both countries were predominant Catholic as a state religion. And so the Pope, they arbitrated a rule, and I think that line that you see, 1494 Tordesillas line, was the treaty. Kind of said, Portugal you can have from here over and into Africa, and Spain you can have west of that line. So, well, I'm going to share probably a few little tidbits that there's so much that I could share, and there's so much. Some of you are just going to have to figure out and research on your own if you're interested. The European colonialism, Spain and Portugal, right, in the first 100 years, 1500 to 1600, the Atlantic slave trade, it started with Portugal. The Portuguese dominated the western Atlantic coastlines of Africa, and so they got in on the Atlantic slave trade in 1526, bringing African slaves into Brazil. So yeah, early on, I mean, remember that the British didn't, Jamestown, the first lasting settlement, was 1604. So more than 75 years before the British even set foot and colonized Jamestown, there was an African slave trade, Atlantic slave trade going on. And then obviously the Spanish followed quickly after that. The other image on the right is a typical image some of you might have seen. This is a cross section, or not a cross section of African slave ship, and the number of people and how they fit is just crazy. But yeah, so take a look at that. Okay, and then 100 years later, right, starting in the early 1600s, the British colonized what is the eastern seaboard of today's United States, mostly in what is today Massachusetts and Virginia. Virginia being Jamestown, and Massachusetts being what we consider the Pilgrims. And they also early on in that first 100 years enslaved indigenous peoples The British did, as did the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Here's a map of European colonialism, the settlements by 1650. Okay, the purple, you can see the Dutch. And actually, it was the Dutch that colonialized what is today New York and Manhattan Island. You can see that they called it New Netherlands. And of course, then the English had on the southern, down in Virginia in Jamestown, they had that little area, and then up by Massachusetts Bay Company, Plymouth, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Haven. Well, at the time, that was the area. And then the Spanish, if you look, or the French were up in what they called New France, Quebec, Montreal, and areas around the seaboard there, up in the north above and part of what is today Maine. But you can see that French influence, the French Canadians, that influence still exists up there. And then the Spanish down in Florida, St. Augustine, which the first slaves to set foot on what is today the United States was actually in St. Augustine. The first slaves that were European slave owners. Okay, so the first African slaves of European owners was in St. Augustine by the Spanish around 50 years before the settlement of Jamestown. So we're in the 1650s, 1660s. And of course, then Sweden had New Sweden in that little portion above Jamestown. And obviously, as those settlements grew, there was continued conflicts and tensions between Europeans and indigenous peoples, Europeans and each other, indigenous peoples and Europeans, indigenous people and other indigenous tribes. A lot of the conflicts between the Europeans or between the indigenous peoples, they tended to align themselves with either other native indigenous tribes or with other Europeans to protect themselves. So you had these agreements or treaties or alliances between indigenous populations and different European populations. The French Indian War is a good example of that, right? You had the French and certain indigenous tribes, the French and certain indigenous tribes that went to war against the British and certain indigenous tribes. So you had, it was really kind of a very complex, very interesting. There is a book that's really good about, it's called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's a people's history. So whenever you hear people's history or people's perspective, it comes from the perspective of not the dominant culture, but of the subordinate culture or the conquered peoples or oppressed peoples. Okay, so a good book gives you some insight if you want to look further into that. And then, of course, during this period from 1600 to 1776, the pre-colonial era, or the pre-constitutional era, you had indentured servants and slaves, right? The British were not heavy into slavery. They were into indentured servitude and a very British federal or a feudal system with kings and queens and religion. And, a real good book to read is, it talks about the 100-year period from the beginning of Jamestown and Virginia, and it focuses just on Virginia and the culture. I guess it gets up into the 1700s, called American Slavery, American Freedom. And it gives you some insights, a really good book. I really enjoyed it. It gives you insights into how the colonies started and the indentured servitude and why the indentured servitude, the need for labor, where are we going to get that labor, the need to get poor, overpopulated England and London and overcrowded prisons, and they were going through hard financial, the economy was bad and you had starving people. What are we going to do with these people? Let's put them on ships, give them an option, give them incentives, put them into indentured servitude. And that basically was a contract for most of it. Now there were Irish in the early 1600s and mid 1600s that were captured by the British for speaking Gaelic, for going to Catholic Church, for uprisings and failed revolutions. They were captured, put in chains, put on ships, and sent to America as indentured servants. And then, of course, the African slave trade was already underway for over 100 years by the time the British started. Now, there is the 1619 project that you might have heard of. The New York Times is behind it, is coming into public schools. And the whole premise of that is to say that the original sin of the United States was in 1619 when a ship in a storm that had taken on water landed by mishap into the Virginia area, and they had actually conquered another ship from another country and taken slaves as part of that. They needed to figure out how to restock their ship and fix their ship with supplies and repairs. And so they sold the slaves to the colonists. Now, the colonists, most historians would say, said, okay, the practice of indentured servitude, you're not chattel slaves, you're indentured servants, and you will work off a term that will pay for what we paid you, and you can have your freedom. So there were early on quite a few free Africans in the United States. Okay, so the legal institutionalized slavery about mid 1600s, 1650. Actually, one of the first legal slave owners was a former indentured servant who was African American, who owned an indentured servant who was African. And the courts ruled through some disputes with his neighbors that he owned the indentured servant as chattel, right? And then the book also talks about how slavery became racialized late in the 1600s, but especially late in I'd say in the as indentured servitude waned and the Enlightenment came, into influence, right? Slavery became a racialized institution around the late 1600s to mid 1700s, and then really big racialized slavery in the 1800s before the Civil War. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Eventually slaves were bought and sold. Now indentured servants were bought and sold too. Now they weren't. It's interesting, right? Because they weren't as people bought and sold, but their contracts for servitude, their labor contracts were bought and sold, which set the table for slaves being bought and sold and accepted within the British culture. Okay, these are some pictures of mid to late 1700 plantation on the left and a slave quarters on the lower left in black and white. A little more meager maybe than the mid 1800 antebellum, with the big columns, and we'll take a look at that, the plantations. But the planter class of people, right, that had some wealth or a lot of wealth, a lot of times they were second born, so they ventured out from England because they didn't have the firstborn plantation in England, right? And a lot of the plantations in the UK, especially in Northern Ireland, if you've ever been to Northern Ireland, right, they had what they call a plantation era, and they enslaved or indentured, actually at the time, indentured thousands of Irish, took their land, similar to what the British did to the Native Americans. So yeah, it's really it's again, very complex, very broad. I won't get too much into the weeds too much. I'll let you do that on your own if you want. Okay, so the American Constitution era, let's start on the left. The Constitution era started in 1776, probably a little bit before that, but we'll call it the Declaration of Independence. That was already kind of in the mix by that time, and it ended in 1807, which was when the Constitution um, set a priority for 1805, but it ended in 1807 when the Atlantic slave trade was made illegal. So you have this Constitution era. Now, what influences is really interesting. So you can see on the far left the picture with the African slave that said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Okay, and that was an abolitionist artist who had created that in 1787. So between the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of the Constitutional Convention in 1887. So it was between the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of what we have today as our Constitution. Now, St. George's was a free black, and he was what they called the modern, or at the time he was the black Mozart of that era, and quite an accomplished. He was free. He was a free man, and there were free men, indentured servants, and slaves. Okay, and then you have Lord Mansfield, who was an abolitionist. He was a judge and a legal scholar, and he, in the mid 1700s, he wrote about from a legal perspective, about um, kind of an anti-slavery perspective. He made a legal argument against slavery. Now, William Wilberforce was probably one of the most influential people. He spent most of his time in England, but I'm not sure he ever really spent much time in the Americas, but through the British, because in the 1700s, the United States, what we think of today, the colonies, they weren't American, they were British colonists. They were British colonists living in what is today the United States. And William Wilberforce was, I think he was the person behind the lyrics of Amazing Grace. But anyway, um, he was a big time abolitionist, and was very influential. And then, of course, at the top right, you have John Locke. Now this, so we went from free blacks that were had high status in society to then legal abolitionists to cultural abolitionists. And then we're going to talk now as we shift into John Locke and Adam Smith. These two are probably most responsible for the British and Scottish Enlightenment that most influenced the British colonists that eventually ended up being the founders of the United States of America, right? And this Enlightenment period, basically, it was this enlightenment about human beings being or having natural rights, or what our founding documents call inalienable rights. And that started to dissolve the feudal system, and gave rise to this idea that we have certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, John Locke said life, liberty, and property. And then Adam Smith comes along, he gets like the title of father of capitalism, right? He was Scottish. Locke was British. Smith was Scottish, and brought kind of a Scottish Enlightenment to the United States. Probably Scottish Enlightenment had probably more influence in our founding ideals and beliefs and philosophies more than John Locke. But John Locke was probably second to some of the British Enlightenment philosophers. So you had this era, right, where this idea of all human beings are created, right, equal, right, as their natural or God-given rights. And that's where, if you look back again at the picture of the artwork of the slave, it says, "Am I not a man and a brother, equally, right, equally assigned or perceived to have what? equal, inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And that's what that whole Enlightenment period was about. Okay, now this original period from the 1770s to the early 1800s, this constitutional era began to wane into the antebellum era as cotton became this incredible product. We had the cotton gin and the steam engine, and you needed labor, right? Farm labor, and slavery was cheap labor. Um, and and then the South embraced, that kind of antebellum culture, agriculture, cheap slave labor, and that whole constitutional era kind of took a back burner to this new economic Southern powerhouse of slave and planters in the plantation era, what we call the antebellum period. Okay, coming out of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, you started to have large plantations and slave breeding, because once the slave trade was illegal, right? But the South still had this need for cheap labor, and slavery was still an acceptable, at least in the South, was an acceptable social practice. So a lot of slave breeding, a lot of the soil had been depleted in parts of the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia, and so they started moving west to new soil, which of course encroached on the indigenous populations and created tensions in the Tennessee Valley, the Ohio Valley. What did the planters do with depleted lands? They did slave breeding as a means of uh, as a means to keep their social standings, their lifestyles. And you can see that picture. That is a modern day picture today of. You can see the difference between what I showed you earlier as a 1700s plantation compared to an 1800s plantation. And then there was a big abolition movement. John Brown, the Kansas, there was a lot of uprisings. There was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin that was published that gave great insight and influence and encouragement to the abolition movement. There were slave rebellions, a few in the United States. The big one, of course, was in Haiti, and it was a big enough slave rebellion that the slaves then said, "We're going to." I mean, almost all the whites were killed, murdered, and then, of course, today Haiti is an independent nation that rose out of that slave rebellion in Haiti. Right? That's when Haiti got its independence, and the government and the dominant culture was African Americans, or not African Americans, Africans in Haiti. And then, of course, the idea of manifest destiny and the movement westward. California became a state, around 1850. Oregon became a state in 1859. Of course, 1865 is when the Civil War ended. 1861, 2 years after Oregon became a state, is when the Civil War started. Okay, so and you had a lot of infrastructure building, railroads and canals. You had Chinese come in and do railroads. You had Chinese in the gold rush, so you had an influx of Chinese, and that, of course, they ended up, because it seemed, kind of the other is encroaching on our jobs, on our ability to get scarce resources. There's a lot of tension between white gold miners and Chinese gold miners. Underground Railroad was the way that a lot of slaves got out of the South and into freedom in the North. A lot of politics involved in that. I could go on in this area for a long time, but I'll let you do your own research in that for sake of time. And of course, then the antebellum period ended during the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, when the North won, the South had seceded. Some people say states' rights, but if you read the Confederate Constitution of the South, it was all about slavery and maintaining their power and way of life, which was foundationally set upon slavery, which had been racialized. Okay, so War of 18. Okay, what else was going on during the antebellum period? What else was going on during the antebellum period was the War of 1812, which was a huge war between the British and the Americans that also involved a lot of indigenous populations. The British, as did the Americans in this war, armed and fostered Indian uh, Native Americans to go against be on the British side, going against America. So you had a lot of this conflict. A lot of the treaties too that were signed um, during different Indian wars before the Civil War. A lot of the treaties, if when the British won and there was a treaty signed because the British or the colonists often won, then they would settle that treaty by taking the land of the conquered. Okay, so a lot of Indian wars also, especially out west, as this manifest destiny, moved out west in the 1800s. A lot of the Pacific Northwest and even like um, the Dakotas and uh, and in the Midwest. A lot of that was the Indian Wars, right? A lot of history on that as well. Missouri Mormons War in 1838. They were kicked out of Ohio. They moved to. In fact, they were by law told you have to move out of Ohio, and if you don't, we will forcibly remove you and we will take your house. And that happened. So, you know, the history of the United States, with different indigenous with indigenous populations, different immigrant groups, wars, battles. It's a very sordid history of an us and them mentality in perspective, right? Trail of Tears, right? Lasted 20 years, moving southeastern indigenous tribes into Oklahoma. Trail of Tears. The Irish and German, for that matter, immigration, but the Irish immigration in 1845, a lot of feudal system was pretty much still going on. The feudal system had starved out. There was a famine, and in 1845, 2 million Irish, just Irish, 2 million, uh, immigrated into the United States. And right now, we have about 1 million. Our immigration policy allows about 1 million people a year currently, but obviously as a percentage that's very small compared to 2 million. So you can see this kind of anti-Irish perspective. And then the Mexican American War in the mid 1800s, and there's a whole history that goes with that. um, and how and part of that part of the Texas was involved in that. The United States was involved in that. um, Texas, of course, was a nation, I believe, at that time. They were at some point. I think that was part of what brought that on. And the result of that was that the United States signed a treaty. They had the upper hand. They signed the treaty, and that treaty allowed the United States to buy California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and part of Utah. Okay. And again, I had Indian Wars twice, but yeah, Indian Wars. Yeah, a lot of Indian Wars going on. And then Oregon statehood in 1859. We'll talk a little bit about that. Um, so, just some political drawings, what they called the Yellow Terror or the Yellow Swarm. Okay. In the mid 1800s, you had a lot of immigration from Chinese on the West Coast. You also had the Mormons, Mormonism, the crocodile sneaking in, right, into this nasty crocodile called Mormons, sneaking into Congress through Utah. You still had, again, Indian Wars. The Irish that were depicted, very poorly, sometimes called Black Irish. Even, the fighting Irish, angry, fighting, drunk, the Notre Dame fighting Irish, the paddy wagon, right, where you put drunk Irish that were belligerent. You put Paddy, which was a very common Irish name, into the end of a wagon that they ended up calling the paddy wagon. So another mm, racialized term. Uh, Again, Chinese coming over the idea of a wall, of immigration policies, right? And of course, then Mexico and the borderline, right? Um, so this had been these immigration and issues of conflict between indigenous populations, between immigration, between other countries and cultures. This has been going on for a long time. This is a cartoon uh, that was popularized, and that's a portrait of Uncle Sam, and he's like beside himself because he's being overwhelmed by immigration. You see Germans and English Irishmen and Irish or Englishmen and Irish, and you have Russians and Negro, Spaniards, and Frenchmen, and then in the very back you see what preempted Uncle Sam was Columbia. So if you ever see Columbia pictures and you see a lady holding, a torch, not the Statue of Liberty, right? Columbia, right? Which Columbia Pictures used as that was kind of the first. So another little tidbit of history for you. And then the Civil War, of course, began in 1861, and that went through 1865. Um, the Gettysburg Address, kind of interesting, right? Abraham Lincoln, 7 years ago, right? So going back to, less than 100 years, right? Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, that's a generic, right? All men are created equal. Now, not everybody had the same rights. Women did not have the same rights as men. Property owners, non-property owners at different times did not have the same rights, civil rights, right? But these are the rights we're talking about, being created equal as to life, liberty, and the ability to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Which again, we've come a long ways from our ideal, right, to what was real, right? And these were ideals that were put forth that at the time of the constitutional era, these were ideals. These were philosophical ideals that they were hoping to achieve, and the current culture, which was the British culture, right, at the time in history, did not match the ideals, right, of the Enlightenment of inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we've come a long ways towards achieving those ideals and still have a ways to go. But that's the cool thing. Martin Luther King invoked, cashing the claim, right, in his speech about equal rights. Okay. And then there was the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era is when the Civil War ended and the North, the federal government, came to the South to protect the rights, right, of mostly of blacks, but of people in general, right, and to reconstruct not only the physical, the buildings that were trashed in the war, but to reconstruct the culture and to unite the culture, right, back into one. Now, emancipation, right, was the 13th Amendment, and of course, in the 14th and 15th Amendment, those three amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, were the Civil War amendments or the slave amendments, right, that were giving freedom and the right to vote and at least to the African American men at the time, right? And so you had the North, right, the federal government, the Army, the federal government coming down from the North, right, and keeping the peace, maintaining, enforcing the law, enforcing the new amendments, okay? And blacks could vote and did, right? And of course, shortly after the end of the Civil War, you had a lot of, you had the first colored or first African American senators and representatives, right? 2, 4, 6, 7, right? Because the population of places like the Carolinas, Louisiana, there were more black citizens than white citizens. The black population was bigger than the white population, and blacks were voting, and they were voting themselves in, not only into the federal Senate and House of Representatives, but also heavy into state legislatures, mayors, city councils. And it was quite a movement. And of course, Abraham Lincoln being a Republican, the blacks were heavy Republicans, as were some whites, but the South was Democrat, right? The planters were almost all Democrats. The Southern white politicians were almost all Democrats. What we called later the Dixiecrats, the Dixieland states were almost all Democrats, and so that didn't sit well with the Democrats, right, and the Southerners, right. So the Ku Klux Klan shook hands, and the Ku Klux Klan was one of several different anti-Republican, anti-Black, anti-North groups that were trying to suppress the political power of Republicans, trying to suppress the culture of Blacks. Not only did they beat, threaten, lynch Blacks, they did that as well to white Republicans. There just weren't that many white Republicans living in the South. So they joined forces to oppress political power and Black power in the South with the White League and other different white supremacist groups. So Democrats, now not all Democrats were Ku Kluxers, but as the saying goes, all Ku Kluxers were Democrats. So yeah, it was quite, yeah, it was a pretty darn controlled era. As a response to losing power, whites rose up, and Southern whites rose up. And of course, eventually, the South, excuse me, the North, right, eventually left, and that's what ended Reconstruction. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So in the Jim Crow era started when the North moved out of the South. The federal troops moved out of the South, and that's what ended the Reconstruction era and handed the South back over to the Democrats and the Southern culture, right? And probably what the catalyst for that was the election in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican. He won the election, but it was contested. I mean, you talk about a contested election. I mean, it was probably the most contested election to this point in U.S. history. There were different voting fraud, different electoral fraud. A couple, in fact, Oregon was part of that. A couple electors in Oregon that were Republicans. Rutherford B. Hayes, he won Oregon, but the governor was Democrat, and Hayes was a Republican. And two electors, I can't remember one of them, but the other one worked for the post office. And you can't be an elector; it's against the law to be. It's against the Constitution to be a federal employee and an elector, right? So they were disqualified, but the Democrat governor appointed two Democrat electors. It was so close, and that changed the outcome, as well as some of the southern states having some voter fraud issues. And so it was a highly contested. It ended up going to a committee. They couldn't decide on it. Then there was this grand bargain that a couple senators and a couple Supreme Court justices negotiated, and what the deal with the devil that both sides made was that the Republicans got Hayes as their president, okay, and the South got the removal of the Northern troops that ended the Reconstruction era, and that's when the troops in the North, that was the compromise with the South, and the troops left the South. And the culture, the antebellum planter culture of the South rose back up and oppressed political Republican political movements, the blacks, Plessy versus Ferguson, was a court case that came up against there was an Equal Rights Act. We think of the Equal Rights Amendment happening in 1964. There was an Equal Rights Act that happened in 1875 that was eventually challenged, and that court case was Plessy versus Ferguson. That blacks thought they'd win because it was an equal rights issue from a kind of like a train or trolley car, right, of segregation. But blacks lost that. The Equal Rights and the Equal Rights Amendment was struck down. The 1875 Equal Rights Amendment was basically struck down, and that's when separate but equal uh, perspective came in, right? Segregation, right? Color waiting room, white waiting room, color drinking fountain, white drinking fountain, white bus, black bus, voter suppression, right? Whether it was a poll tax or a written exam or fear, of being beaten. And then, of course, that Jim Crow era, separate but equal, the Jim Crow era ended in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education Act, right, which gave everybody equal access to and equal opportunity to education, regardless of the color of your skin. Now, during that Jim Crow era, there were some movements, and Frederick Douglass was a big proponent of equal rights and constitutional inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington started the Tuskegee College, which was one of the first black colleges. He taught there. Um, and both Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, their idea was that we can do this. We have the ability to educate ourselves, to work hard. We can rise up and compete in this free society. But it's going to take a lot of hard work, and we're going to have to do it. We can do it. We can do it. Right now, W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Harvard doctorate graduate that was African American, and he said, that's going to take too long. What we need um, social justice, and we need it right now. And we need laws and that will get us out of this Jim Crow era. He was early 1900s. He started what was called the Niagara Convention, right? And at the same time of this Niagara Convention, the NAACP had also started, white female had started that. The Niagara Convention, did okay, and then eventually the NAACP invited the Niagara Convention to fold in and become one umbrella under the NAACP, and they brought Du Bois in as an early leader. Okay, he sometimes gets credit for being a founder of. He was an early proponent of and CEO, basically, if you will, of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Okay. All right. So elsewhere during the Jim Crow era. So what else was going on, right? So we had World War One. The Spanish-American War was also before that. You had you had a really severe depression around 1890. It didn't last as long as the Great Depression, but it was more severe. It was a quicker recovery, even though it was more severe. It was a quicker recovery. But anyway, then you had immigration reform. So we were being, as the United States was being so overwhelmed by immigration, especially this new Eastern immigration coming in, and like Czechoslovakia, Romania, and it was like there was just bad perspective, stereotype, racial prejudice, and discrimination against Eastern Europeans, Russians, Polish, and so they created this, or they passed an immigration reform. Congress passed in 1924, and it really really limited immigration, right? And which wasn't opened back up to a larger degree until 1965. And then, of course, you had the Great Depression, right? Oh, and you had the Spanish flu, right, which was a pandemic back in the 1917 to 1920. And then you had, before the end of the Great Depression, you had World War II, right? And then, of course, you had American Indian boarding schools. So there was a lot of other things going on, uh, in this country, outside of this country, in the world, um, right? But so you had World War One, and you had all the poisonous mustard gas. You had the Great Depression. Unemployment rates in the 20 to 25%, like one fourth of all Americans were unemployed, whites and blacks. Then you had World War II. You also had the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Of course, you also had German internment camps during World War One and World War II, and some Italian internment camps as well. So, um, yeah, man, it was just pretty crazy. And then, of course, you had the American Indian boarding school, which was kind of a cultural genocide of Americanizing or assimilating, trying to assimilate indigenous populations into the American culture. And then the Civil Rights era from 1954 to 1968 started with Brown versus the Board of Education, which said equal access, not based on race, no segregation in schools. Rosa Parks, of course, in 1955, who was arrested for riding in the white part of the bus, which then brought on in 1956 the bus boycott. And so blacks who were willing to say, we're going to boycott the buses because they're of the racist policies. We're going to ride bikes. We're going to walk instead of taking the bus. And that really put a crush on the busing, which was government subsidized. So yeah, it got a lot of traction, right? And then you had the Woolworths lunch counter sit-in in the 1960s, which was part of the civil rights movement. They practiced this in basements of being called names, spit on. You can see they're getting stuff dumped on their hair and heads. And there were white people with black people that were fighting on behalf of equal rights that sat at these counters where they were separate but equal, not supposed to be sitting at these counters, and they did anyway. And that was a an act of civil disobedience for equal rights. There was also the Freedom Riders, who got on the buses, white and blacks, got on the buses in the North and then rode to the South in the front of buses, which really riled the South. And eventually, a couple of buses ended up getting lit on fire by the South and burnt up, and it was pretty crazy. And then, of course, the March on Washington, which ended in Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Out in front of the Lincoln Memorial with the Washington Memorial in the background by the reflection pool. So that was in 1963. And then, of course, Bloody Sunday was the March on Selma that resulted in heavy-handed social control of the National Guard and police. So again, there's a lot in this. There's some great documentaries. If you don't want to read, there's some great documentaries out there. Let me know if you're interested. You can either search them or you can get a hold of me. I can give you some recommendations. And the civil rights era also, legislatively, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, President Eisenhower passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Started as a very strong piece of legislation to bring equal rights to all people, blacks and whites, blacks and women. And the Democrats watered it down, so barely passed. But after getting watered down, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Believe it or not, there was a far higher percentage of Republicans that voted for it, almost all Republicans, compared to a lesser percentage of Democrats that voted for the Civil Rights Act. So the Republicans, I know it kind of blows your mind, Republicans were in 1964 uh, had a far higher support of the Civil Rights Act than Democrats, especially those Democrats that were in the South, which they called the Dixiecrats. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so that eliminated any discrimination or bullying at the voting polls. The Civil Rights Act got rid of any uh, discrimination by the government as it relates to gender and race. And then, of course, Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, and MLK was assassinated in 1968. So Malcolm X was a bit of he was a Marxist early on in most of his adult life. And his perspective was to, he saw structures of power and oppression. Although, the Black Liberation Movement or the early Black Panther, his Malcolm X still was like, hey, we're going to rise up and do it on our own. We just need a chance and a space and an opportunity. Martin Luther King was also tended to be more like Booker T. Washington, in that, give us the promise of America of equal of all men are created equal, men being generic, born with certain inalienable rights, right? Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he was saying, hey, here's what your ideal is. And you say it's your ideal. How about putting your feet on the ground and putting the rubber on the road and making it happen? Let's make it real instead of just this ideal for all people. And of course, in the Fair Housing Act, no discrimination in housing, which eliminated redlining by banks and by real estate agents and neighborhoods. Okay, so that was a lot of civil rights era legislation in the 60s. And then, of course, elsewhere during this period of time, you had the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the fear of getting a nuclear bomb and the Red Scare, and you had Korean and Vietnam War, and the war marches, and the Cultural Revolution. You had second wave feminism, which was all part of that sexual or cultural revolution in the mid 60s into the late 60s. You had Woodstock, and of course you had the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened up immigration. So there was a lot of there was culture wars going on at that time. The Cold War and the fear of a nuclear Holocaust happening, second wave feminism, in addition to the Civil Rights Act along racial lines. Okay, race and ethnicity from 68 to present. So what are some of the social issues during this post-civil rights era time? You have immigration issues, racial integration in sports and entertainment, with like the Jackie Robinson story. African Americans as NFL football quarterbacks, tennis. With being such a white sport, you had I can't think of his name right now, but you had what was his name? He won the Wimbledon and won the U.S. Open. The criminal justice system, you had getting tough on crime. Crime had risen. You get tough on crime in the 60s. You had 3 strikes and you're out. Prison reform, Trump's most recent prison reform act, government and politics, a lot going on there as far as equal rights. Politics, the NAACP, which is a political movement for equal rights for African Americans. You have La Raza for Hispanics. You have the NACI for Native Americans. Different Asian groups have the similar organizations. So a lot of politics involved, multiple. Um, yeah, there's a lot of political organizations for groups and subgroups and subgroups of subgroups. You have the Black Caucus, you have President Obama, so changes in um, uh, politics and representation. You have academia, which we talked and we'll talk about intersectionality, critical race theory. So there's a lot of changes there. If you want further reading, The New Jim Crow is a great book to read. Also, very similar to the Netflix documentary. Well, I wouldn't call it a documentary, but the Netflix movie 13th. White Fragility is a very popular book, kind of interesting. Um, so you want to talk about race, some good perspectives on intersectionality and critical race theory. Angry White Men, kind of the defensive response to losing power or the status quo being challenged. Stamped from the beginning, kind of a social constructionist perspective or a critical constructionist perspective. So these top books are a bit more progressive, cultural Marxist. Then you have Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, which we're reading The Real History of Slaves. White Guilt by Shelby Steele, we'll do a little bit of that. Losing Ground, which is interesting, Charles Murray, right? He looks at American social policy from 1950 to 1980, right? He kind of breaks it down into two segments: the first 15 years from 1950 to 1965, and then Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society from 1965 to 1980. And you can kind of see, whoa, for example, the marriage rate amongst um, African Americans was higher than it was in the white culture, right? For children being born in marriage, I think, or the marriage rate, or anyway, yeah. So a lot of the disparities, um, Charles Murray at least says, yeah, it was some of these disparities are due to poor public policy. And then, of course, Please Stop Helping Us, Jason Riley, kind of an interesting perspective. And then, of course, Discrimination and Disparities. I referenced that in another lecture by Thomas Sowell. So those are kind of some other, from kind of more of a modern perspective of the last 50 years. Those kind of are some really good books that people recommend in this space. So hopefully that's been helpful, and hope that we have that this has not been too long, but that it's been informative, and hopefully whet your appetite maybe for further investigation. You have so much available at your fingertips to get on and look at and tap into the information that's out there. So good luck, and hope this has been helpful, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.